He heard it between hammer strikes. A voice from the tree line coming through the interval of silence between one blow and the next. He stopped to listen, not because he had decided to stop, but because something in the sound had arrested him before thought could intervene. He stood with the hammer raised, and he listened. He recognized it before he understood what he was recognizing. Not the words, the quality, the specific quality that a voice had when it was yours. The pitch that was always slightly different from how you imagined it. The rhythm of the phrasing that was as particular to you as your handwriting. The specific timbre that was not describable, except to say it was yours and you would know it anywhere, because you had lived inside it your whole life. He recognized it the way you recognized a face, instantly, before analysis, as information the body received before the mind could form the question. It was his own voice, calling from the deep woods. Samuel Cord had been working iron since 1814, when his father had first put a hammer in his hands, and he had been running the smithy at Holt Hollow's West End since 1839. He was 51 years old in the spring of 1845, and he knew the sounds of his work the way he knew the sounds of his own body, the specific ring of his hammer on different metals, the hiss of iron in the quench, the voice of the bellows at different speeds. After 30 years of it, the smithy's sounds had become a second language to him, one he understood without translating. The smithy sat at the edge of the settlement for the practical reasons that smithies always sat at the edge. Fire safety, the need to keep the forge separate from the structures around it, the benefit of the prevailing west wind for the bellows. This particular placement meant that the smithy faced the timber. The settlement was behind it to the east, and the woods were in front of it to the west, 50 yards from the forge to the tree line, the cleared ground between occupied only by the smithy itself and the quench barrel and the woodpile. He had worked with that view for 6 years. He knew the timber the way you knew something you looked at every working day, the specific character of it in different light and different seasons, the way it looked in the morning before the leaves were fully out, and the way it looked in summer when the canopy was complete and the understory was a wall of green. He knew where the deer came out at dusk. He knew where the wind hit the timber and where it was sheltered. He knew, in the accumulated way of 6 years of looking, what that tree line looked like at every hour of the day. He also knew the intervals. A blacksmith's work was rhythmic, but not continuous. Between the hammer strikes were the assessments, lifting the piece, reading the color of the iron, deciding the next blow. Between the heats were the weights, the iron cooling in the air or heating in the fire, the specific patience of a man who understood that the metal had its own timing and could not be rushed. In those intervals, the world outside the smithy arrived. The wind in the ridge timber, the sounds of the settlement behind him, the creek running below the west end of the clearing. He had been listening to those intervals for 30 years. He knew every sound that belonged in them, and how it sounded at every season and every hour. He knew precisely what did not belong in them. He heard his own voice for the first time on the morning of April 3rd, 1845. He was working a set of hinges, the repetitive work of shaping identical pieces. Lift, strike, assess, lift, strike, assess. And in one of the assessments, in the interval between a strike and the next lift, he heard it, coming from the tree line to the west. His own voice, at a volume appropriate to someone 50 yards away, saying something he could not quite make out. He lowered the hammer and stood still and listened. Nothing. The fire, the creak, the wind in the timber. He went back to work. In the next interval, he heard it again. Clearer this time. His own voice from the tree line saying his name. Samuel. He knew that voice. He had been hearing it for 51 years in the specific private way that you heard your own voice. Not the voice that came back to you in an echo or in someone's impression, but the voice you heard when you spoke. The voice that was inseparable from the act of speaking. The quality of it that was yours and only yours. He set down the hammer. He looked at the tree line. Nothing visible. The timber stood as it always stood, dark and dense and still in the spring morning, the leaves not yet fully out, the understory still open enough to see 30 feet into the trees. Nothing moved. He called out, "Who's there?" The timber stood quiet. He waited for a moment. Then he picked up the hammer and went back to work. He spent the rest of the morning in the intervals, listening. He heard it twice more, once when the bellows were quiet, and once in the still moment before he lifted the finished hinge from the anvil. Both times the same quality, the same location in the tree line, the same voice that he recognized as his own, before he recognized what it was saying. The third time he heard words, something he had said the previous day to his apprentice, a short instruction about the fire temperature. The timber set it back to him in the interval between the hinge leaving the anvil and his hand reaching for the tongs. He set the tongs down and stood still and thought about what he had heard. 3 occurrences, his own voice, the tree line, words he had said before. No visible source. He picked up the tongs and went back to work. He told no one that day. He was a man who processed things carefully, who preferred to have a clear account of what he was dealing with before he brought it into someone else's attention. What he had on April 3rd was 3 occurrences and no explanation, and 3 occurrences was not yet enough. He had heard his own voice from the tree line. He did not know what that meant. He was not prepared to say, without a second occurrence on a different day, that the explanation was not something ordinary. A neighbor who happened to share some quality of his voice, a sound from the settlement that had traveled through the timber in a way that distorted it, something to do with the wind angle and the specific acoustics of the cleared ground between the smithy and the trees. He was prepared to wait. He waited 2 days. The second occurrence came on a still afternoon when there was no wind to carry sounds from the settlement, when the only sounds in the smithy were his own hammer and fire and the creek below the clearing. No wind, no neighbor. His own voice from the timber saying, "The frames sound, the bolt holes are the problem." Words he had said that morning to Thomas Finch at the settlement edge in his specific delivery of professional assessment. Direct, without preamble. He had said them at approximately 10 in the morning. It was now 2 in the afternoon. He was at the bellows in the early afternoon, building up the fire for the afternoon's work, when he heard it. Not from the tree line this time. From deeper in the timber, perhaps 100 yards in. His own voice carrying through the trees at the specific pitch of a voice that was speaking at a normal conversational volume and whose sound had traveled. He heard it clearly enough to hear the words. It was something he had said that morning. He had been talking to Thomas Finch at the settlement edge earlier, giving Thomas his assessment of a plow frame Thomas had brought for repair. He had said, "The frames sound. The bolt holes are the problem." He had said it in his specific way of saying things, direct, without preamble, the way a man who had been asked for his professional opinion gave it. What he heard from the timber, at 100 yards, was his own voice saying, "The frame's sound. The bolt holes are the problem." He stood at the bellows and held very still. He heard it once, then silence. He put down the bellows handle and walked to the tree line. He spent 30 minutes in the woods. He knew woods the way a man who had grown up on a ridge knew them, not as a hostile environment, but as a familiar one with a specific character and a specific readable evidence of what had been in it. He walked the tree line for 200 yards in both directions, and then walked in 50 yards from the point he had been working nearest, and covered the ground methodically. He was looking for a person, or the evidence of a person. A camp, a shelter, tracks, disturbed leaf litter. The evidence that someone had been standing in these woods, speaking in his voice. He found nothing. The leaf litter was undisturbed. The ground between the trees showed no impressions of feet. The understory was intact. The timber gave him nothing. Not a broken twig, not a displaced stone, not any of the small evidence that a person moving through woodland left behind. He came back to the smithy. He looked at the tree line from the smithy's position, from the position he had been in when he heard the voice. He thought about the geometry of it. An echo required a surface at a specific angle. A reflected sound took the time that light took. Fractions of a second. Not the imperceptible but present delay of a sound that had traveled through 100 yards of air. What he had heard from the timber did not have the character of an echo. It had the character of a voice originating from a point in the timber. His voice originating from a point in the timber. He went back to work. He began keeping a record. He had a small notebook he used for the smithy's accounts, and in the back of it he began writing down the occurrences. Date, time of day, approximate location in the timber, what the voice said, and when he had said those words himself. He did this systematically, the way he approached any problem that needed to be understood before it could be addressed. He had been keeping accounts his whole working life. He knew how to record things accurately and without embellishment. The pattern became clear within the first week. What the woods said in his voice was always something he had said. Specifically, recently, within the same day or occasionally the following morning. It was always a phrase or a sentence, never longer. It was always delivered in the tone and cadence in which he had originally said it, not a general impression of his speech, but the specific delivery of the specific utterance, as though the timber had been present when he spoke and was replaying what it had received. The frame's sound, the bolt holes, are the problem. Said to Thomas Finch at mid-morning, heard from the timber in the early afternoon. A delay of approximately 3 hours. Come back Tuesday. Said to a customer at mid-afternoon, heard from the timber the following morning. A delay of approximately 18 hours. It'll hold, said to himself while examining a completed piece, heard from the timber an hour later. A delay of approximately 1 hour. He noted the delays. He noted that they were not consistent, not a fixed interval he could reduce to a rule. Variable, between 1 hour and 18 hours and occasionally longer. The timber seemed to hold what it received and return it on its own schedule, without reference to any pattern he could determine. He noted that the voice was accurate, not approximately his voice. His voice, He had been inside his own voice for 51 years, and he knew it the way you knew something that was inseparable from you. The specific pitch, the specific rhythm of the way he phrased things, the way his voice sounded when he was giving professional assessment versus when he was addressing someone personally, versus when he was speaking quietly to himself. The timber had all of these. It had not one register of his voice. It had all of them, deployed correctly for the utterances it was replaying. He spent a full evening sitting with this fact. He told Nathan Webb's father. Josiah Webb was 44 years old in 1845 and had been keeping the Hollows records since 1835. He would pass the habit and the notebooks to his son Nathan in 1861. He was a man who had the same relationship to unusual events that Samuel had to the sounds of the smithy, a long familiarity with them, a developed capacity for observation, a specific resistance to the comfort of premature explanation. He came to the smithy on the morning of April 14th, when Samuel told him what had been happening. He listened to Samuel's account, and he looked at the account book with its 3 weeks of entries, and he said, "I'll come and listen." He came the following morning and sat on a block near the smithy entrance with his notebook. He did not interfere with Samuel's work. He simply sat and listened and watched. He noted the conditions: a light wind from the east, the smithy's own sounds substantial, the timber fully leafed and the understory dense. He sat for 2 hours. He heard nothing. He wrote, April 15th, 2 hours at the cord smithy. No occurrence. Wind from the east. Possible that this affects the transmission from the timber. No conclusion can be drawn from a single negative observation. He came back 4 days later. The wind was from the southwest, a light morning wind that crossed the clearing from the timber to the smithy rather than from the settlement to the smithy. He heard it within the first hour. Samuel was at the anvil in the middle of a heat, the hammer moving in its rhythm, and Josiah was on his block with the notebook open. In the interval between 2 consecutive strikes, the interval that was perhaps 2 seconds, the interval Samuel used to assess, the voice came from the timber. Josiah heard it. He looked up from his notebook. Samuel had already set down the hammer. "That's you," Josiah said. "Yes." "What did it say?" Samuel told him. It was something he had said to his wife 3 days before. A specific instruction about the charcoal store in the shed. An ordinary domestic sentence, spoken once, in the cabin, in a private moment. Josiah held the notebook for a moment without writing. He had heard Samuel Cord's voice. He was certain of it. Not as a resemblance, not as an impression, but as the actual voice, the specific pitch and cadence and speech patterns of the man standing 10 feet from him. He had been in this hollow his whole life, and he had known Samuel Cord's voice for 15 years, and what he had heard from the timber was that voice. He wrote, April 18th, 1845. Present at the cord smithy from 8 a.m. Heard a voice from the timber at approximately 9:15 a.m. Unmistakably, Samuel Cord's voice, pitch, cadence, speech patterns. The voice said a phrase Samuel confirmed he had spoken 3 days prior in a private context. Delay between original utterance and timber reproduction, approximately 72 hours. He wrote, "This is not an echo. An echo requires a reflecting surface and a delay measured in fractions of a second. What I heard had a 3-day delay and originated from within the timber. These are not the properties of acoustic reflection." He wrote, "I heard Samuel Cord's voice from the deep woods. Samuel Cord was standing 10 feet from me at the time. He underlined the last sentence, not for emphasis, because he needed the physical act of marking it to confirm to himself that it was the sentence he intended to write, and that he had written it accurately, and that he was prepared to have written it in a record that other people would read. The voice began calling Samuel's name in the second week of April. Not the replaying of phrases, a direct address. His name in the specific calling tone he used when he wanted to get someone's attention across a distance. Samuel. The particular rise and fall of it, the carrying quality, the voice directed outward and upward, the way you directed a voice when you were calling someone who was 50 feet away. His calling voice, directed at him, from the timber. He heard it on a Wednesday morning, in the interval between a hammer strike and the next assessment. He heard his own name, in his own calling voice, from the deep woods. He answered before he thought about it. He called back, "Here." The word was out of his mouth before he had time to register what he was doing. He had been answering to his name for 51 years, and the response was deeper than thought. The specific reflex of a person who hears their name called and responds, because that was what you did when your name was called. He stood at the anvil, with the echo of his answer in the air of the smithy. He had answered himself. He had heard his own name in his own voice, and he had answered it. He stood there for a moment, with the hammer in his hand, and the smithy around him, and the timber in front of him, and thought about what had just happened. He thought about what it meant to answer your own name when it was called from a place where you were not. He thought about the specific quality of the response, the automatic, unthinking quality of it, the 51 years of conditioning that had produced it. He did not answer again. He told Josiah that evening. He described it carefully. The name, the tone, his answer, his catch. Josiah wrote, "The voice has begun addressing Samuel directly, not replaying phrases, using his name in his calling tone as a direct address. This is distinct from the replay behavior." Samuel noted he could not identify a specific past occasion when he had called his own name in this way, which would mean, this is not a replay. It is the voice using his patterns to do something the voice is doing for its own purposes, which is to call to him. He paused in the writing and then continued. Samuel answered before he registered what he was doing. He answered himself. He heard his name, and he said here. He is disturbed by this, not by the voice which he has partly accommodated, but by his own response to it. The response was automatic. He could not have stopped it. He wrote, "There is a difference between a thing that replays what you said and a thing that calls to you. I do not know what this difference means for what the timber is." The searches of the timber were, by the third week, a regular part of Samuel's practice. He had developed a specific method because he had thought carefully about what he was looking for. He was not looking for a person. He had established after the first search that there was no person, and the timber held no evidence of a person. He was looking for any physical mechanism that could explain what he was hearing. A surface, a structure, anything that could produce a directed sound from a specific location in the tree line. He entered the timber at the apparent origin point and walked outward in a 50-yard radius, looking at the trees and the ground and the understory. He found nothing on any search. The timber was unused in the specific way that woodland unused by people was unused. The leaf litter undisturbed, the ground between the trees showing no impressions of feet. The understory intact, No broken branches at the height a person walking through would break them. He had been at the edge of this timber for 6 years. He knew what the boundary between the cleared ground and the wood looked like in spring when the deer moved through it, what it looked like when a raccoon had been working through the understory the previous night, what it looked like when absolutely nothing had been through it. It looked like nothing had been through it. He told Josiah about the searches when Josiah asked. Josiah came and confirmed on 2 visits, walking the timber himself. "Nothing," Josiah said. "No." Samuel was quiet for a moment, then, "Whatever makes the sound, it doesn't walk." Josiah looked up from his notebook. "Or it walks and doesn't touch the ground," Samuel said. "I'm not saying that's what it is. I'm saying that's what the evidence says. The ground shows nothing. Either nothing walked in there, or what walked in there didn't leave the marks of walking." Josiah wrote, S. Cord, "Whatever makes the sound doesn't walk, or walks without leaving evidence of walking. I have searched the timber twice and confirmed undisturbed ground at the voice's apparent origin points. The ground at this location in this season would hold impressions from a person's weight. The ground holds nothing." He sat with his notebook and thought about the evidence he had assembled. He thought, Samuel's voice, the timber, no person, no mechanism, his voice from in there, saying things he had said and things he had not yet said. He wrote, "It was not that someone in the woods sounded like him. It was that the woods were speaking in his voice." The morning of April the 29th, Samuel was at the anvil early, before the settlement had fully woken, in the specific quiet of an Ozark spring morning, before the day's sounds accumulated. The fire was not yet at full temperature. He was doing the light work of sorting his tools, organizing the day's tasks, the quiet preparatory work of a morning. He heard his own voice from the timber. It said, "This iron needs another pass before it'll hold." He stood very still. He heard the silence after the words, and he stood in it. He had been keeping the record for 3 weeks. He had written down every occurrence, every phrase, every instance of timing. He had learned the pattern. The voice said what he had said, at a delay. It was a replay. It was always a replay. He searched his memory for when he had said those words. He could not find it. He went back through the previous day, back through the day before, back through the past week's work, the customers, the pieces, the conversations. He could not find a moment when he had said, "This iron needs another pass before it'll hold." He had not said it. As far as he could determine, in the careful way he had been accounting for these things, he had not said it. He stood with the sorting tool in his hand, and the fire not yet at temperature, and the timber 50 yards in front of him. He went back to work. He worked through the morning. He did not think about the phrase, or he tried not to think about it, which is not the same as not thinking about it. He worked the fire up and started on the day's first piece and moved through the morning's tasks. At mid-morning, he picked up the latch mechanism, a piece he had been working for a customer, a latch that had required more adjustment than he had anticipated, the joint not quite right from the previous day's work. He held it up. He turned it in his hands. He examined the joint. He said, "This iron needs another pass before it'll hold." He heard the words come out of his mouth. He set the latch down on the anvil and stood in the stillness of that moment. He had said the words, in the exact tone and the exact phrasing that the timber had said them 6 hours earlier. He had not thought the words before he said them. They had arrived from wherever words arrived, fully formed, the right words for the assessment of the joint he was looking at. He had said them the way you said any professional assessment, directly, without preamble, because they were accurate. The timber had said them at 6 in the morning. He had said them at mid-morning. He stood at the anvil and looked at the timber and thought about the direction of it. He had been assuming the woods took in what he said and gave it back later. The record supported this. But if the record also included this morning, if the timber had said the words before he said them, then the direction was wrong, or the direction was not fixed, or the timber did not experience a difference between what you had said and what you were going to say. He could not tell if he had heard the phrase from the timber and then said it. He could not tell if the timber's version had entered him and become his own. He could not determine the origin. He closed the smithy at midday. He went home and sat at the table and wrote, April 29th. Heard, this iron needs another pass before it'll hold. Approximately 6 a.m., said the same phrase at approximately midday. Do not know which came first. He wrote, I have been assuming the woods were repeating me. I am no longer certain this is what is happening. He wrote, I am no longer certain which direction the information moves. He did not stop going to the smithy. He had work to do, and a family to feed, and a trade that was the settlement's only source of ironwork. The hollow needed a blacksmith the way it needed a mill and a church. It was not optional. He went every morning, and he opened the smithy, and he built the fire up, and he worked. And the voice was there in the intervals, and he did not respond to it. He had answered his name once. Once. He stopped after that. Stopped answering, stopped going to look, stopped writing things down. He had the record from the first 3 weeks. And the record was what it was, and continuing to document each occurrence would not change what had happened or what was happening. He learned to work inside it. This took longer than he expected. In the first days of not responding, he found that the suppressed responses were still present. The impulse to look up, the impulse to call back, the impulse to walk to the tree line. He had been answering voices his whole life. The voice from the timber sounded like him, and spoke in his patterns, and his reflexes wanted to treat it as a social situation requiring response. He had to actively override the impulse each time. After a week or so of this, he stopped having to override it. The voice was still there, but the impulse had worn down to nothing, the way a habit wore down when you stopped feeding it. He heard his own voice from the timber, and he continued working. He heard his name called from the deep woods, and he continued working. He heard phrases he had said and would say, and he let them arrive in the intervals and pass, and he continued working. He found that the voice, now that he had stopped responding to it, occupied a different position in his awareness. It was present, but it was not demanding. It said what it said from the timber, and the timber was 50 yards away, and the work was in his hands, and the work was where his attention belonged. He told Josiah, when Josiah asked, that it was like working with a second version of himself present, one that was always slightly behind him, repeating what he had said, and occasionally slightly ahead, saying what he was about to say. A companion I didn't choose and can't address, he said. Josiah wrote this down. He wrote in his final extended entry on the subject, May 1845. Samuel has settled into a working accommodation with the voice. He describes it as a constant background presence in the quiet moments of his trade, not threatening, not alarming, but persistent and unignorable. He has stopped searching the timber. He has accepted that he will not find a cause. He wrote, "I have visited the smithy 4 times since April 18th and heard the voice on 3 of those visits. It is always Samuel's voice. It always says something Samuel has said or will say. On one visit, I was present when the voice said something, before Samuel said it, and then heard Samuel say the same thing approximately 2 hours later. I have been keeping records in this hollow for 10 years. I have recorded unusual events. I have not recorded anything that raised the specific question this raises, which is, if a place takes in what is said there and gives it back on its own schedule, including ahead of the original, then what is the place doing? Is it memory? Is it something else? Is there a word for a place that knows what you are going to say before you say it? I do not have that word. I have the record. The voice in the woods never said anything he hadn't said before, until the day it said something first. He stopped answering when he heard his name. He stopped searching the timber. He stopped writing down the occurrences. He stopped trying to determine which came first, his words or the timber's version of them, because he had determined that he could not determine it, and the attempt was changing how he worked in a way he did not want to allow. He needed to be at the anvil with his attention on the iron. The timber would do what the timber did. But in the quiet between hammer strikes, in the specific interval he had been listening to for 30 years, the interval that held the sounds of the world outside the smithy, he still heard himself calling. From the deep woods, in his voice, saying things he had said, and sometimes things he hadn't said yet. He worked. He listened. He never went into the timber again. But the timber was 50 yards from the anvil, and the intervals were always there, and his voice was always in them, patient as the trees, returning what he had given it on its own schedule. He worked. He listened. He never stopped hearing what it had to say. If this story stayed with you, there are more waiting. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. These are the stories from the edges of the recorded world.